answered in kind. 9. What is absolute truth? The perennial difficulty of collective governance does not arise merely from conflicting interests, but from a far more elusive fracture, the dissolution of consensus regarding what is ultimately true. When a society no longer agrees upon its axiomatic premises, law ceases to be an instrument of shared meaning and becomes instead a mechanism of imposed coherence. The question, then, is not simply how to govern, but from what metaphysical ground governance can even proceed. What precisely is an ultimate truth, and by what criterion does it earn the adjective ultimate? A proposition universally asserted yet privately disbelieved does not function as truth. It operates as ritualized compliance. Conversely, a truth deeply apprehended by one consciousness but inaccessible to another cannot be legislated without distortion. The moment a truth requires force to sustain itself, it reveals its contingency. That which is genuinely ultimate persuades by resonance, not coercion. Human communities are not merely aggregates of bodies, but constellations of meaning-making organisms, each interpreting existence through layered perceptual, cultural, psychological, and symbolic matrices. Even when two individuals employ identical lexicons, the semantic payload of their words may diverge radically. Terms such as freedom, harm, justice, or hate often mask entirely different internal referents. One speaks of moral violation, another hears existential threat. One names protection, another experiences erasure. The tragedy is not disagreement itself, but the pretense that agreement already exists. Within such conditions, suffering becomes ubiquitous and unevenly distributed. Lives are lost not only through violence or catastrophe, but through the quieter absences. Lack of access, lack of care, lack of mobility, lack of mercy. Death arrives by many corridors, economic, geographic, bureaucratic, and often without malice, only indifference. When tragedy is retroactively moralized, when grief is treated as culpability, society crosses an invisible threshold. It begins to punish existence for failing to conform to doctrine. Here, the invocation of sacredness becomes paradoxical. Life is proclaimed inviolable, yet its preservation is subordinated to ideological rigidity. Compassion is conditional, extended only to those whose circumstances align with approved narratives. The body, particularly the vulnerable body, becomes a site of regulation rather than reverence. When law constrains care not due to impossibility but prohibition, responsibility is displaced from outcome to abstraction. Suffering is reframed as collateral necessity. This phenomenon is not new. Hierarchical systems have long preserved themselves by conflating control with order and obedience with virtue. The insistence upon fixed roles, who must lead, who must follow, betrays an anxiety not of chaos, but of autonomy. If certain beings were truly without power, there would be no need for such relentless containment. Suppression is always reactive. It testifies to a feared potency. Underlying these structures is a pedagogical failure. Societies that prioritize doctrinal transmission while neglecting interior governance produce citizens fluent in slogans yet illiterate in self-regulation. Emotional intelligence, ethical discernment, and introspective capacity are treated as ancillary rather than foundational. The result is a populace trained to outsource conscience to authority and complexity to simplification. Fear-based literalism replaces reflective wisdom. Obedience substitutes for understanding. In such an environment, governance becomes compensatory rather than generative. Freedom is restricted not to cultivate mutual flourishing, but to mitigate the instability produced by unexamined inner worlds. Control proliferates where self-knowledge is absent. Individuals exhausted by the maintenance of imposed hierarchies age prematurely, not always in years, but in vitality, having never been taught that attention itself is a formative force. For consciousness is participatory. Where awareness rests, identity crystallizes. What one repeatedly attends to becomes the architecture of one's being. This is not mystical ornamentation, but phenomenological fact. The refusal to examine one's projections ensures their unconscious enactment. The attempt to bind others' freedoms externalizes an internal dissonance that has not yet been reconciled. History, though fragmentary, offers sufficient testimony. Constraints upon human anatomy generate resistance proportional to their severity. Free will, whether acknowledged or denied, reasserts itself. Attempts to govern against it resemble touching an electrified boundary repeatedly, insistently, while mistaking pain for righteousness. Wisdom lies not in further contact, but in learning to withdraw the hand. The ethical center, then, is not domination, but alignment. Alignment between inner conviction and outer action. Alignment between collective structures and the lived realities they purport to serve. Alignment between reverence for life and the conditions that sustain it. To miss the mark, to sin, in its most archaic sense, is not a moral failure so much as a navigational one. True authority arises not from the capacity to restrain, but from the ability to orient. A society that teaches its members to govern their own minds, to metabolize emotion, to interrogate belief, and to extend curiosity where fear once resided requires fewer chains and fewer enforcers. Sovereignty assumed inwardly need not be policed outwardly. In the end, the question is not whether ultimate truths exist, but whether we are mature enough to encounter them without weaponization. Perhaps the most ultimate truth available to collective life is this: that freedom constrained breeds fracture, while freedom honored invites responsibility. To recognize this is not resignation, but remembrance, an acknowledgement of a law older than statute and deeper than doctrine. And when such recognition finally dawns, governance ceases to be a battle for supremacy and becomes instead a shared practice of discernment, humility, and care, answered in kind. Praise love and pass the compassion.